So, we're going to talk a little bit about what is trauma and identifying some of the key pieces behind it that we really should know when we're working with someone who has experienced trauma. So, when we talk about the brain and the basics of the brain, what we really have to dive into is there are different components here, right? There are different elements that we have to be really aware of. And the thing that we really focus in on is the idea of the limbic system. And that is what houses our amygdala. Now, when we think about what's happening with someone who's experienced trauma, they come in to see us. There's a lot of emotions, a lot's going on, but really their brain has been activated, right? Something has happened that has caused the brain to go, oh, there's a threat, there's fear here, and it is learning, how do I now keep this body and this person safe? Now, the limbic system is a piece that we need to look at because it's what we work with when we think about the amygdala being hyper responsive or having that hyper arousal that we often see with trauma or PTSD.
The amygdala is the centerpiece of the trauma universe and also stress and anxiety, anything on the stress, anxiety, trauma spectrum. But we're going to delve into the amygdala and the specifics of the amygdala later in this episode. So, Dr. Siegel was nice enough to develop like a hand model for we who are challenged when it comes to neuroscience and what have you. And I really love what he's done here. When you take your hand, basically folding your hand up in a fist and placing your thumb in the middle, what we've got is kind of a physical metaphor for the brain, or an example of the brain here. And in the beginning, or the front part here, is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part that we're all really proud of. It's where we make decisions. When we're making good decisions, that's where we make the prefrontal cortex. It's our executive center. It's how we make the choices that we make. It's also the newest part of the brain, hardest to access. And if you are hungry or angry or it's late or you're tired, it's the hardest to access. And I might add sick onto that. And if you've been drinking, those are why we make poor decisions and choices neurologically, very hard, challenging part of the brain to access. As we open up the hand, here in the middle, we see the amygdala. And that's that apparatus that Dr. Spencer was just talking about. It fires the fight, flight, or freeze apparatus in the brain. It's like in the fire station, when the fire station, all the lights go off and everything, and everybody jumps to attention, and they're getting into their clothes and they're getting on the truck and they're going out the door, does the same thing for the body. The interesting thing about the amygdala, where it's settled, if we open up the brain here, it almost sits on top of the hippocampus. And why is that important? The hippocampus helps us to understand where we are in time and space, but it also generates new memories, new thoughts. Now, if someone's getting a lot of stress hormones, specifically cortisol, dumped on their body over a period of time, it actually shrinks the hippocampus. Now, remember, it lets you know where you are in time and space, and also helps with the generation and creation of new thoughts. And so this better explains why people who have been through trauma get these repetitive flight of thoughts. They just can't seem to get out of that thought cycle, because the apparatus in the brain that allows that to happen has actually been shrinking because of the trauma and because of the cortisol and other hormones that are being dumped on the brain. The rest of it, the brain stem here, spinal column, and of course, all through the thumb area is the limbic system. Dr. Spencer, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I want to focus in a little bit more as well on our prefrontal cortex, and that would be where we consider from like the top little knuckle and down to our fingertips, our fingernails right there. The prefrontal cortex, and you see how it lays over all of these pieces, right? It kind of lays over the amygdala, it lays over the rest of it. It's kind of centered in on the hand. And if you think about that, I want you to think of it as the integration component. of the brain. So our prefrontal cortex is what kind of makes sense of all of these elements and helps us to kind of, if you think of like a meditation or awareness, right? I feel like those are key buzzwords everywhere, like creating awareness, that is all of that would actually be centered into integration. Dr. Siegel talks a lot about how our wellness and well-being comes from this right here because it integrates all of these pieces together to help give us a sense of who we are and then who we are in relationship to others. So when the amygdala is being activated, this actually doesn't happen. And that's why I like his model in general. It it pulls this integration component up, and this part becomes the center, the most activated component where we can't get all of this. Now, if clients came in and we wanted to talk about what they've gone through, and we wanted to pair together problem solving, and we wanted to put all of these pieces together, it would look like this. But a lot of times when the brain is activated with trauma, it actually looks a lot more like this. So we don't have access, as Dr. Brown says, we don't have access to these pieces. We don't have access to kind of put that down and have this fully integrated experience and discussion that's rich with this idea of how do I move forward. So that's a key piece just to kind of to point out when it comes to this is that what we are striving for in treatment when it comes to trauma is kind of getting this whole piece put together. But often we're working with the client when they've come in and there's been some activation in the brain.
Yeah, and he would say you actually blow your top, and this top part is the cortex where you do a lot of the majority of your thought processes come from. And why that's important too is once the amygdala is fired, the rest of the brain is just along for the ride. And so when you're meeting, potential victim or whatnot, and they are beyond upset, or maybe they've been traumatized, trying to speak to that part of the brain, trying to get them to recenter or whatnot, have cognitive processes or something that causes or encourages cognitive process is very problematic because that part of the brain is largely shut down due to the firing of the amygdala.
Which one piece I'd say put a pin in that because we might come back to it later, but this also speaks really heavily to why if we look at treatments that do not include the body and regulation of the body, that we can't really always put all those pieces together for healing to move forward effectively. So these elements, when we're like this and we're activated in the brain and the body, we don't really have that thought and discussion and a problem solving and integration component available to us. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper. What is trauma? I think the word trauma, especially nowadays, kind of is thrown around a lot. Like that was so traumatic. We hear that a lot now in discussion and society discussion. But the reality is, it is an emotional response to a terrible event. Okay. And after the event, you start to have feelings of either shock or denial. These are very typical things. The long-term reactions are what we often see is when someone comes in and they've had starting to have flashbacks or it's starting to impact the relationship. I love how van der Kolk talks about, trauma is not a illness in the sense of it only happens to the person. It's actually a relationship disorder because that person ends up being very strained in identifying with who they are and connecting to other people, feeling safe with the people that they felt safe with before. You can see physical symptoms of it. You can see headaches, you can see nausea. So these are not what we consider just a psychological illness. This is actually an injury. We have the physiological components that's happening to the brain.
Yep. I was recently in a restaurant. I was sitting across from a lady at a table next to me, and she'd come out and, she was kind of, there's a lot of energy there or whatnot. And she had shared loud enough for all of us to hear that she had dropped her phone in the commode.
Oh,
And she said that she had been traumatized. And so there's a kind of to build on what Dr. Spencer was talking about earlier. A lot of people throw around this terminology. Trauma actually has a set criteria. It is a diagnosis and whatnot. But I think the simplicity of what Dr. Van der Kolk had to say, and also the fact that, and just keeping in mind that actual trauma is a brain injury. The brain never fires the exact same way after someone's actually been traumatized. But a lot of people will throw around very loosely the word trauma, even though it may not apply to what's actually being experienced in their body or their brain.
So trauma differs from our experience of stress. When we think about like a daily sense of stress and dealing with deadlines and dealing with phone calls and emails, all the emails. But it differs from what we think about when we think about stress. Trauma essentially evokes a sense of fear. There is a feeling of safety or helplessness that is now being questioned, right? There can be horror. It is that perceived threat that really changes the way that it interacts with our body and our ability to process it and to move forward. So it's not to say that that trauma always happens in this way. It can happen in a lot of different ways that you have a perceived life-threatening situation or perceived safety. But that evoking of fear in that moment is really, I would say, like a hallmark if we think about, and that really is characterized by our stress response, right? So the trauma experience itself can be very life-changing. I love that Robert Grant even in his literature talks a lot about how it changes the way we even think about the spirituality of life, because here's something that happens that puts you outside of the box of the way that you thought life happens. It makes you question all of these components so that you are now on the outside of something like, I never thought that would happen to me. I never thought that experienced to me. And so trauma is incredibly shifting and changing. And as Dr. Brown said, you know, your brain, your neurons are not going to be firing in the same pathways and patterns as they did before. So it's really common for someone to say, this isn't the same person that I've married, or this isn't the same daughter that I knew, or this isn't the same sister that I've connected with. They're very different. So it really is significantly more than when we think about just stress. It really is a pervasive experience that changes everything about us. One of the things that we also need to remember, especially about trauma, is that, as Dr. Brown mentioned with the hippocampus, and just keep this in mind because we're coming back to this, is that the narrative component, meaning our story, the way that we've created and our brain has remembered and put together our story, because it changes our hippocampus and how we're processing memory, how we're hanging on to it, and the sensations that we have as well, because we're talking now about two different components of the brain. We're talking about the narrative component that puts the story to it, and we're talking about the memory where it has all the feelings and the images and sensations. These pieces are essentially disconnected when trauma happens. And so when they try to explain the narrative, there are components here that are ultimately hard to put together. It's one of the reasons why you see, if someone explains the story of their experience if they were sexually assaulted, that there could be variations in their story because these two pieces were essentially pulled apart when trauma happened in the brain. So the part of the brain that has the sensations, memories, the images, the smells, all of these pieces doesn't necessarily have the narrative or the words component of the brain there when it's being encoded and putting into the memory in the hippocampus. That's why you also see when someone is triggered that sometimes they can be flooded with more detail and more of the image than they even had the ability to access when they first were telling the story about what happened to them.
What's incredibly applicable here, especially for first responders, if someone has been through an assault in a way and it's been traumatizing, as you begin to process the story can change. And it's not because they lied to begin with, it's that some of those, the initial thoughts were somewhat compartmentalized in order for them to survive. And as you process through and as they feel safer and begin to processing, some of those details that were compartmentalized begin to come out, begin to surface. That can be very problematic for someone whose story changes as it relates to someone who's been in a traumatic event, particularly if you are a first responder and you took down their initial incident.
Mhm. All right, so as we mentioned, the amygdala and that limbic system, when we're really talking about it, that is truly the button that turns on that fight, flight, freeze, faint. It's another, or shut down. There's another terminology that you'll often hear with this. And this is actually a normal response, right? Like this is the way that our brains respond. Is it does activate to keep us safe. And when the amygdala activates, what it's activating is actually the sympathetic nervous system. So your autonomic nervous system has two components. It has a parasympathetic nervous system and it has a sympathetic nervous system. And I actually think we probably have a slide. Boom, we have a slide for that. And so we have two systems here, okay, that are working in this binary response. So one is turned on, the other is turned off. One is turned on, the other is turned off, right? So the amygdala is that button, right? That when it gets activated, when it goes, oh, there's a threat in here, we need to switch on the sympathetic nervous system. We have a lot of things that happen there, right? Our heart rate increases, our palms get sweaty, the digestion ability, like we actually kind of shuts down. So we're not trying to work on digesting anything. We're actually trying to like either get up and fight or get up and run. So a lot of pieces happened. And even you'll notice like even the way that your lungs, right? The expansion of your lungs, all of these, there's so many things that happen. And that is our stress response. And the hallmark of a stress response, the hallmark of turning on that sympathetic nervous system is to mobilize energy in the body to where it needs to go to get you to a place of safety. So that's exactly what it's trying to do. Sympathetic nervous system is trying its best to keep you safe. It turns out your brain really likes you. So it's a huge fan. It wants to keep you alive. So when we have that sympathetic nervous system activate, and Dr. Brown likes to call this like the Red Bull, right? When you drink a can of Red Bull, that amygdala is going, hey, there's a threat here. Let's move. Let's get going to keep us safe. Now, flip side, so remember I said they're binary. So the sympathetic nervous system, let's say that turns off. And the parasympathetic nervous system turns on. Well, there's your warm cookies and a glass of milk. This is the creative side of you. This is the rest and digest side of you. And this is the part where we start to see, right? We have a lower heart rate. We have all of the systems are now not just thinking about in this moment for survival and safety. Now that part of the system is thinking about long term. It's thinking about let's digest this food, get all of the good nutrients out. Let's invest in our immune system. Reproductivity is an investment of the parasympathetic nervous system. So we have a lot of elements of this system that are absolutely amazing. It's very creative and problem solving. And that's the thing that we always hope when we work with clients who are coming in and wanting some kind of resolution or relief from something. We always hope to tap into that. But the reality is when trauma is involved, and even the threat of trauma, meaning thinking about it, exposing them to the memory of it, talking about it, bringing up some of those triggers, that sympathetic nervous system is what actually gets activated. Interestingly, we have to really think about the physiological changes of the sympathetic nervous system and what that means for the person to have it activated. For example, the cortisol that goes through the body, the hormone response that's happening to mobilize the energy in the bloodstream, the lining of your heart wall actually thickens so that it can pump faster, so it can get these pieces of glucose and energy where it needs to be. So we're not talking about just thoughts, right? We're talking about real physiological changes to the body. Okay, so we're going to go back to this. So when we have that sympathetic nervous system that gets activated and we go into fight, flight, freeze, faint, what you really want to think about is when these things are happening, and this can be amazing information to share with individuals that have had trauma, so they know these are normal responses. This is our normal defense, that our brain does this, right? That we tend to have this response because our brain has detected that there's a threat, and it was something that really made our sense of safety questionable, right? So remember the helplessness, the feeling of horror, the feeling of intense evoking fear. So these are some of the symptoms that you might see when that comes up. Okay, so we have an amygdala, actually, even though we say amygdala, there's two on both sides. Dr. Brown, tell us where it is.
Yeah, sure. Not that we would ever encourage anyone to do this,
No.
but if you were to take your finger and run it through your eye and through your ear, where they connected on both sides would be where your amygdala is. Amygdala is Greek for almond because it's the kind of the shape of an almond, and that had to be an interesting situation. The first person who dissected the brain and found the amygdala and somehow thought, this looks like an almond. Let's name it after an almond. Maybe they were hungry. I don't know. But it's again the centerpiece of that, what Dr. Spencer's been talking about. It's one of the things that initially fires and dumps all the Red Bull, related chemicals on the body that gets everything ready to fight, flight, or freeze.
So the amygdala has an incredibly important role. It's not just to keep us safe, but it actually is, the limbic system is part of what tells us what we think about things. Like it's the evaluator, the judger. Like, is this thing a good thing or a bad thing? And it actually encodes fear, it encodes triggers and effective memories. So one of the other things to flip the script on, we're just talking about fear and heaviness and terror. Let's flip the script, is think about someone that you really cared about and you smelled their perfume or their cologne. So there would be some attachment there to that sensational, like I smell this, makes you maybe think of something, that person, a great memory, right? This is part of our encoding, right? So our senses and our the way that we're perceiving and that we're pulling in information all the time. So the amygdala is what encodes some of these pieces. So we're not just talking about fear, but we're also talking about bonding, how we bond to people, sexual behavior. So there are a lot of great things that it does in addition to its role with trauma. I don't want you to see, part of me doesn't want you to feel like it's a bad guy. It's not a bad guy. It's a good guy. It's trying hard to keep you safe. And it does some other really great things too. But it is the key factor, right? And when we're talking about trauma, it's one of those key factors because of that button that kind of turns things on and turns things off. But it is a key role in the encoding process. So as I mentioned, it has a key role, and it's attaching that emotional significance to situations or objects. And it's really helping us to kind of form those emotional memories. Okay, again, negative, but also positive. So the other piece that we need to think about is that, the amygdala basically has a direct line. I mean, it's super fast in the way that it responds, it gets activated, and it's much faster than the cortex. I'm going to pass this off to Dr. Brown.
One of the things that, as we talk about the amygdala, we talk about emotional bonding. I like to give the example of if you ever remember maybe a fond childhood memory of a parent, grandparent, or whatever, maybe they cooked something very specific around the holidays. And every time you smell that, it takes you back to that instance where you walk in the door and you smell what's cooking. And it just fills you with that kind of, I've arrived, I'm at home kind of sensation. That all comes from the amygdala. And the reciprocal is true as well. Let's just say you went through a not so great relationship with someone, and you run across someone else who's wearing their perfume or cologne or whatnot, and it can take you back to that instance and dump a lot of negative triggers on your body just from those senses. All that comes from the amygdala.
So the amygdala, we have to kind of point out, it's not really logical, right? It's not stopping and going, let me think about that for a second, right? That's really our cortex that's thinking through all the possibilities and thinking all these pieces, right? But our amygdala is our responder. It's just jumping in there, making sure that everything's safe, and it's going to make snap judgments for your safety, and it's going to be very conservative in those snap judgments. Meaning, if it's even close to something that your brain has already identified as a threat, then it's going to be really conservative and go, yeah, that's probably a threat, and it's going to respond, right? We want it to be responding. It's what kind of keeps us safe. But the other piece of that is that if we went through, let's say that instead we went through the cortex, which is way more logical, and we were like, hey, there's something for you to respond to, it would take a significantly longer amount of time. And by then we might already be dead or hurt or in harm's way. So it's 1/20th of a second that our amygdala responds. So we are talking about a significantly fast, almost, I would say almost instantaneously, that our brain is picking this up even before our cortex has really even lodged that there's something happening. It hasn't even figured out what we're doing yet. So it's really important that we think about, sometimes we talk to clients about like, well, stop and think about these things. And it's like, wait a second, the cortex hasn't even registered that we're doing something while the amygdala is already starting this response, right? So it's not a logical part of our brain. It's a survival based part of our brain. So can your brain differentiate between a real or a perceived threat? No. No. Even perceived threats, they activate our sympathetic nervous system. And here's the other component. Our brain, our amazing, wonderful brain, is constantly learning how to keep us safe. And what I mean by that is that if it's identified a threat, and so I'll say if if someone was in a car driving and an explosive went off and it was in a brown container, every time that you drive by something brown, the brain is going to go, wait a second, I remember that when that happened, when that exploded, that it was brown. I remember it was on the right side of the road. It's going to be scanning for anything similar. It is constantly learning what are all those little pieces that I can widen what's similar, widen what triggers may happen, that I can widen it out, that I can keep myself safe longer. So one of the things that, when clients come in and they say things like, I don't even like, I didn't even think of that as being a threat. It just kind of happened. I didn't even think that was going to happen. For example, fireworks, when you have responded to a mass shooting and you hear fireworks going off and it sounds similar. A lot of clients go, I didn't think that that was going to happen. I've never had an issue with fireworks ever. And suddenly now the brain is trying so hard to keep you safe that it's expanded and widened the criteria. Anything similar to that sound now is very close. So a perceived threat, even hearing those sounds, can cause that sympathetic nervous system to kick right back on, to where now you're having a hard time breathing, you're feeling very panicked, your hands get clammy, you're searching around, looking, trying to make sure that you're in a safe place. So these are things that, again, the amygdala isn't really logical. It's not thinking through these things in a logical pathway. It is responding. whether that response is um, a real threat in that moment or whether it's just a perceived threat in that response.
Yep. And when I first moved into my new home, it's probably been 7 years ago or whatever, I had friends who wanted to come over and celebrate with me. And I thought, I don't know if I want them all traipsing through my house, and it still had that new home smell to it and everything. So I put down pavers beside my house, and I have a lot of large, kind of pampas grass and monkey grass and whatever. And as I was down on my hands and knees, I was putting down these pavers. I saw a snake out of the corner of my eye in the grass. So I jumped like 3 foot up and 10 feet over, and then after I landed on my feet, and the first thing I did was look around to see if any neighbors saw me, because who wants to be like jumpy jumpered in their new
The
neighborhood
weird
or
guy.
whatever. But as my eyes focused and adjusted, what I recognized was not a snake. It was a piece of an old hose pipe. My amygdala did not differentiate in between, is this a threat or a perceived threat? It's all threat, and we had a reaction. Why that's critical is if I kicked over to my cortex, which is much slower moving. If I was waiting to figure that out, if it had been a snake, I'd already been bit. And so it reacts so quickly, so as to protect us, basically.
Yeah, love that story. All right. So when these traumatic experiences are happening, and as I mentioned it earlier, is we're seeing this pulled apart experience, right? That trauma really disconnects our two sides, right? It disconnects all those emotions of like feelings, images, sensations, right? The smells, the what you're seeing, what you're hearing, all those pieces, right? It disconnects that from the narrative. It disconnects it from us being able to put the timeline and all of the pieces together. So, one of the things I really want you to think about is trauma is, again, keep in mind, trauma is not just a physiological experience. It is actually not a psychological experience, actually a physiological experience. So they're really having a hard time putting together the whole story. Now, why is that important for us to know? Truly, the reason why it's important is because the point of treatment is to kind of bring those pieces back together. We're going to unify that image, the sensation, we're going to unify that with that narrative, right? We're going to put the cortex. So remember what we said before? We're going to have this experience. So look at that. That came right back around. We started with this and we pulled it all back together. So we're going to work with the brain. And that's why we used body-based work when we think about trauma. We're going to work with the brain to have that integration, to bring all of these pieces together so that we can process it, so that we can derive meaning from it, we can explore it, and then we can move forward with it, as now this is a part of their experience. It'll never be forgotten. It can never be erased, but we can move forward with it, knowing who we are now with that trauma. One of the things I also think it's really important to point out when we can when it comes to trauma is that we're not just working on feelings and we're just working on these thoughts. We're actually helping the body in a significant way. And for me, this is a hopeful point of working with individuals with trauma, that what we know about that prolonged stress response, right? If the person continues to go through their life with that activated stress response, because trauma continues to activate it, and they stay in that sympathetic nervous system response, ongoing and ongoing. What we know about that now is that the sympathetic nervous system response, it really steals from the longevity of the system. So it steals from the ability to invest in the immune system, to invest in healing of cellular structure. It steals from reproductive health. So it steals from the system because it's constantly focused on what's happening right now instead of in the future, being able to build for the future. when we help individuals who have trauma and we work with the body in trauma treatment, we are not only working for them to have relief in the now, but we're actually working with them to have health in the future, because that prolonged stress response can cause actual sickness. So I find that to be a really helpful and hopeful thing to know about working with trauma, because I think a lot of clinicians feel like, whoo, that's a lot. Not sure where to start with that. Not sure where to go. Then I think it's really hopeful to think, wow, not only can we work to move forward and have relief now, but it's really impactful in the person's health and their future. Dr. Brown, do you want to share anything before we wrap up?
No, I go back to the importance of this and understanding trauma, particularly whether you're a first responder, whether you're a person that's trying to help an individual in general, understanding that trauma is a brain injury helps us like empathize with the people in front of us. It's so much easier if somebody comes in with a cast on their arm. We might hold the door for them. We might help them carry something in or whatever. It's one of those situations where you see it and you know how to operate around that and empathize to it. It's different when someone has this kind of brain injury or whatnot. They don't come in with this bandage around their head or what have you. Yet it still is just as significant, if not more significant, than like a broken bone or these kinds of things. So understanding the depths of trauma and to be able to delineate that from what some people are using in the common parlance of our time as trauma, which is not really trauma. It's more drama than trauma. Understanding the difference, I think, is really critical in being able to empathize with the person and be able to help them effectively.